Hello everyone, my name is Mark Jarvis and I'm a visiting professor at Manchester Metropolitan University. Welcome to the third webinar in this series, which are recorded every other Thursday. The weeks in between, there is a live meeting via Zoom with a different topic and different guests each week. So to find out what's happening next week on the 21st of May, please email cpe@mmu.ac.uk or keep an eye on my profile on LinkedIn, where I will post a link to register for this event as soon as it's up and running. Today, we're going to, of course, start by an update on the virus, but move on to what's happening in the global lockdown across the world. Move on to the GDP impacts across the globe, focusing on the UK, of course. We'll look briefly at some VAT initiatives that are happening across countries to support growth, and then do our regular focus on sectors, finishing with a post-lockdown environment, what it might look like for offices. But first, a few words on today's news. On the 17th of April this year, Roche announced the development and upcoming launch of its Alexis anti-SARS-CoV-2 test to detect antibodies in people who have been exposed to the disease. Antibody testing, as we know, is central to help identify people who have been infected by the virus, especially those who have been infected but do not display the symptoms. Additionally, the test can support priority screening on high-risk groups, such as our wonderful NHS health workers, food supply workers who may have already developed a certain level of immunity and can continue serving and or returning to work. So once we understand more about the immunity of COVID-19, it could also help society return faster to normality. But it's been approved today in England, so some good news I'm happy to report. However, I'm afraid there's not much else good news this week. To start with, we can't avoid looking at the virus case numbers, and if I may share a screen with you. Here we see the countries with the most COVID-19 cases. And of course, you would expect that given the US is the third most populous country in the world, it would be heavily impacted. But China and India are number 1 and number 2 in terms of population, and their case count is way off the top 10, and even below, say, Turkey and Brazil. So probably some more analysis to be done there. I wanted to also share a next slide, which is the, let's call the Great Unlocking, as the IMF has referred to it. The table shows significant difference across Europe and in some few selected places around the world of what we're going through in terms of schools, retail, services, etc. A lot of green in the Czech Republic, Denmark, Norway, Poland, Sweden, and significant green in China and South Korea. Germany continues to be very cautious, as does the UK, as we know. That elusive R number, the R factor, which we've all heard about and know now, must be kept below 1. And concern is already seen in South Korea about their unlocking stance and the subsequent increase in R. This is all very new for all of us, of course, and we'll just have to be prepared for flexing in the new environment. Of course, the key to reducing the lockdown is a vaccine. There are some 80 programs right now developing vaccines around the world, and we would expect that 8 or 9 may come to fruition. 3 important factors here, though. Vaccines typically work for only 80% of people, despite manufacturing ahead of test results, unheard of before. It's unlikely to be readily available until Q2 next year. And finally, this type of vaccine will need to be stored, transported, delivered at between 2 and 8 degrees centigrade. Many emerging and developed countries may find this difficult to achieve, which of course has a direct impact on their countries and their people, and of course to the global solution. Moving back to the GDP and the macro environment, if I may share another slide with you. And this looks at the global corona stimulus packages. And you can see there's a huge variety of percentages of GDP that has been applied to the response. Japan, already having a very sluggish economy, has felt it needed to put 20% plus GDP. The UK here, as you can see, at 5%. But a number of stimulus packages moving, hopefully, to turn this around. Interesting to look at the stock markets and a snapshot of the US here. Unbelievably, the NASDAQ, one of the US's key stock market indicators, is showing that it is back already ahead of the end of year numbers. I think we have to be a little bit cautious about that. Because there is a significant quantitative easing and stimulus package, as we saw on the previous slides, but still something to be cautiously optimistic about, I think. Nevertheless, if we touch on the US again, the unemployment there is pretty frightening. So predicted 32% unemployment, greater than the Depression in the 30s. And many of you have seen this slide from me before in a different format, but this shows the weekly initial jobless claims in the US and for the last 30 years. And then again, this red line is not the end of the graph, but is the number that was filled because of the COVID virus. So 33.5 million filed for unemployment in the 7 weeks ended May the 2nd. This translates, of course, into a significant GDP growth drop, minus 4.8% here, and not surprising, obviously. Back to Europe, I think we should look at GDP and how it's, I think, literally wreaked havoc on our economies. And if I may look at one more slide here, you will see how the economies have suffered. The European Commission released its spring forecast, which shows COVID-19 is wreaking havoc across all of the economies. The collective GDP of the EU 27, which excludes the UK, was expected to grow 1.2% this year, but is now forecast to contract by 7.4%. By contrast, the financial crisis only led to a contraction of 4.5% back for the EU 28, including the UK, in 2009. So the current crisis has pushed the EU into the deepest recession since its foundation, and unemployment rates, I'm afraid, set to rise dramatically. Last year, unemployment across the bloc was 6.7%, and is now forecast to be around 9%. And as we can see from this slide, Greece at the top here, which made tremendous progress since the financial crisis, is now almost at the 10% reduction level. This data also shows that no EU country, a member state, is going to emerge from the crisis unscathed. Even though Germany has suffered a far lower death toll than many of its neighbours and is slowly easing its lockdown, Europe's economic powerhouse is still predicted to see GDP shrinking by 6.5% this year. So the situation is improving, of course, but many of our leaders remain cautious due to the possibility of a second wave. Certainly, fundamentally, there is uncertainty around forecasts and the danger of a deeper and I guess more protracted recession is a very real threat. Perhaps, and I'm sorry for this continued negative news, but this is where we are. This is where we find ourselves. What's more troubling is ING did a projection of Q2, which of course is more severe than Q1 because everybody has been in lockdown in Q2. And this really shows a truly frightening picture of possible scenarios. I stress this is possible scenarios. Much of this is unknown and speculation, but something for us to consider. So even though we have data only for 1/3 of this quarter and economic activity will not immediately return to normal, the impact is already about twice as strong in most countries for Q2 as it was in Q1. In some advanced economies outside the Eurozone, it's even worse with that, looking at the US and Australia. This means that the decline in the second quarter will definitely be more severe as we return to the new normal. And we will remain in a very gradual decline for the coming months. All of this means the unprecedented crisis will show another unprecedented face. The inflow of dreadful macro data will continue. So although the worst may be behind us, we have a lot to make up. Turning back to the UK, the UK slipped by 2% in the first quarter, but the period between April and June will see a much steeper decline, again following what I've just been talking about across Europe. We're still cautiously optimistic of a V-shaped recovery, as we've discussed on other of these webinars, but whilst we were thinking of perhaps a recovery to normality in the late 2021, we could see it slip to early 2022. The economy, again, in the UK shrank by 2% in the first quarter, but almost by 6% in March. So to put that into context, this 6% figure is roughly the same amount that was shed from peak to trough during the financial crisis, so which occurred over several quarters. So the speed at which this crisis has onset has really been alarming. It's clear, and we always talk about sectors, it's clear that the landscape for many sectors has changed for the foreseeable future. Given social distancing measures are likely to be here to stay for some time, at least until a vaccine or equivalent medical breakthrough has come through. The hospitality, the leisure and hospitality sector, which may be able to open in a limited way from July, will find it difficult to return to a profitable operation in this environment. The likes of restaurants and bars often rely on high volume, low margin models. So for the wider high street, which our Prime Minister has signalled could begin to reopen in June, the more immediate challenge will be enticing customers to visit. A recent YouGov survey has highlighted just how wary individuals are about returning to a range of consumer-facing businesses after lockdown measures have been eased. So the mix of challenges here is meaning the economy is entering into a highly uncertain phase. The risk now is that a wider proportion of firms begin to make more permanent changes to their business models, which has a longer term impact. Of course, the recent announcement to extend the job retention scheme in the UK, where businesses are able to furlough staff and receive the bulk of their wage costs back from the government, should be a key insulating factor for the economy. So I won't go into the details here, you're probably well aware of it, but looking briefly employers currently using that scheme will be able to bring furloughed employees back part-time. Employers will be asked to start sharing with the government the cost of paying people's salaries, but the net effect for the employees will be an 80% salary up to 2,500 a month cap. Another area which I think the UK and many countries are looking at is what to do with VAT and how changes to its application may assist a turnaround for sectors. A short-term solution posed is a temporary cut in VAT levied on most goods and services in the UK. The standard rate is, of course, 20%. However, this could be slashed. This is because a cut in VAT would encourage Britons to go out and spend, providing a well-needed boost to the economy. We do think there will be a VAT cut, but not until summer, obviously. Cutting now would be ineffectual since consumers are not really going to the high streets or restaurants, but there's a general consensus throughout Europe that this is a way forward for an extra stimulus to the economy. Greece is reviewing a 2% cut to catering VAT. Norway's delayed of returns and reduced VAT from April the 1st. Ireland, an interest waiver on June and July VAT payments. Austria is cutting non-alcoholic beverages VAT to 10%. Interestingly, Saudi Arabia has hiked VAT to 15%, but as you're probably aware, the oil prices has put a lot of pressure on the Saudi Arabian economy. The UK, focusing on that, HMRC has deferred all VAT payments until June 2020, as you probably know. Note, returns must still be filed, but there have also been some economic help in the PPE sector, which have had a free from VAT applied to them from the 1st of May to the 31st of July, saving those care homes some 100 million of purchases. So many businesses, I think, say they would like a deferred payment period for custom duties and import VAT. So we'll have to see how the government feels about that. Turning to sectors, again, as we always do, they're not evenly distributed, with some factors facing a complete stop. I think it's worth touching, and again, I apologize, but this is a data from the US, but I think it's applicable probably for many countries here, where we can see the unemployment rate by sector. And as we discussed earlier, the leisure and hospitality sector is the one that's hit. Clearly wholesale, retail, education and health service, and then government workers in the US. And the US does have a significantly higher proportion of government workers here. But focusing on the leisure and hospitality, if I move to another interesting slide, which looks at restaurant diners and how the impact is that on whether they've literally gone to the restaurant. And as you can see quite clearly, they haven't. So we've talked before about this sector and in particular restaurants. The reality is that the restaurant sector has never had a large-scale modern event of this magnitude. The restaurant industry, I think, will see a new reality post-COVID-19. But what does it look like? Recovery will obviously be a challenge for all restaurants, both large and small. There will be a rebound that won't happen overnight. Unfortunately, restaurants will be closed or thinned. Approximately 15 to 25% as a whole, according to some reports. In March alone, we've seen a 3% permanent closure, with April looking to hit an additional 11% of restaurants that will close doors. So moving forward, takeaways, delivery will be a staple of the industry. There will be also a shift in consumer focus on the touchless customer service, customer experience. Pre-shift employees, temperature checks will be implemented as a safety process. Supply chain may see a dip in production, but I think that will be short term. Restaurants may see, though, a 3 to 6% increase in sales growth as consumers venture outside. And of course, cash-strapped consumers will be looking for value offerings. I think restaurant concepts will need to invest in drive-through or pick-up window options in construction designs. Concepts will have to reduce the dining room footprint as they continue to see a trend of more takeout and delivery. The enforced period of innovation will leave many of these brands irrevocably changed, and given that returning to the previous models will be impossible. This will be a lifelong change. If hotels, restaurants, and bars aren't viable as standalone options with reduced customer density, maintaining these new marketing and revenue streams will be a necessity. It will be something that has to be done. For example, we may see several pre-pandemic trends gain wider adoption. Outlets such as London's Dice Dessert Parlour, which offers environments tuned to photographing food for social sharing, are well placed for the future. And some of our more familiar restaurants, like Gaucho, is now turning to delivery. And I think embracing that change so quickly as Gaucho has will really put these types of restaurants at the forefront of the change in the new year. Similarly, Starbucks, experimental pickup only stores, launched in New York and now being launched in the UK. We'll see a much faster and broader rollout, I think, of that. So restaurants which have for several years struggled with the increasing through flow of delivery drivers on the restaurant floor will start to reshape to accommodate them and pick up only customers. So together these forces mean that the idea of hospitality as a brand, as something tied to a specific place, may diffuse into something different. So finally, as we move into a post-lockdown environment, it's worth a minute to look at how our office lives may change. Home working will continue, I think, but office life in some form will too. The challenge lies in how to adapt workplaces. If I may share you one more slide here. Interesting title, Should I Stay or Should I Go Now? This is a quick survey about what people are thinking they will do in a post-COVID-19 restrictions lifted environment. And as you can see, there's still a lot of nervousness about cinema, pubs, clubs, concerts, sporting gym, and even restaurants and malls, museums. Only 18% not planning to avoid anything. Supermarkets obviously being very much embraced, and as you can see from your daily trip or weekly trip to the shops, that is still very much accepted by people. So, but what about looking at the office space and the office worker? This is another interesting slide, and I'm sorry, I'm doing a little bit of slide overkill this week, but I think some of this data is very interesting, is what is happening to the working from home. So 43% of this survey showed that these people expect to work remotely more often. And at the bottom there, 8% already worked remotely full time. So then we have 51% saying that they'll either remotely work or they will remotely work more often. Only a 12 think they'll work more in the office, which I think is fascinating. But we do think there are going to be changes in this environment, without doubt. Global real estate company Cushman & Wakefield has risen to the challenge with a new design called the 6 feet office, or the 2-meter office. It's a way of transforming existing office spaces into where the 2-meter rule is in force, which governments may continue to mandate for some period of time. I'll show you a vision of their office, and you can see the circles of social distancing. Other leaders in the field, such as Arjun Kaika, who led the workplace team at Architects Foster and Partners for a decade and now heads up analytics and insights at Zaha Hadid Architects. He predicts the current pandemic will radically reshape office furniture. Many big global firms have pursued a plan to reduce office square meterage, and office desks themselves has shrunk from 1.8 to 1.6 now to 1.4 meter or less for many years. But he thinks we'll see a reversal of that, as people won't obviously want to sit so close together. His view is that the density in offices will change, forecasting a move away from open plan layouts. Zaha Hadid Architects new headquarters for the Bihar Waste Management Company in the UAE may be a glimpse of the future. It's packed with what ZHA calls contactless pathways, whereby employees rarely need to touch the building with their hands. Office doors open automatically using motion sensors and face recognition. Lifts and even a coffee can be ordered by a smartphone. So technology could also be used to remind employees of social distancing. Cushman & Wakefield again has installed beacons into its office to track employees' movements via their mobile phones, potentially sending alerts when the 2-meter rules are breached. So after COVID-19, our company is really going to want to put their entire team in one place where they're closely mingling with other businesses. And finally, the elephant in the room is, will there be actually any offices? Will the world's legions of new home workers want to return to their workplaces, and will employers want them back when remote working could save them money? To reduce this kind of contact, employers are considering solutions such as staggering arrival times, directing office foot traffic, staging areas for elevators, and temperature checks at work. So WeWork is reducing the amount of seating in lounges and conference rooms and creating one-way hallways, and it plans to issue new seating distancing guidelines to its 600,000 clients. Uber is planning to get its staff back to their offices in San Francisco, but with only 20% of its staff allowed in the building on a given day. In the US, one study conducted by researchers at the University of Chicago showed that as much as 37% of the country's jobs could potentially be done remotely. So the shift to remote working has already led to questions over whether traditional office working space is, after all, as much a requirement as originally thought. Is this the kick change which will make a dynamic change in our office space environment? Employees are now well and truly set up and used to working remotely. And it will be difficult for employers to say no to employee requests to work from home more frequently in the future. Software aimed at facilitating remote working, such as Zoom, is by no means new, but companies have now been left with no choice but to learn and embrace it. A total shift to working from home seems unlikely, of course, not least because this pandemic has emphasized how important social interaction is to all of us. However, it seems likely that many companies will evaluate their current setups and be open to trying new, innovative ways of working. So much news, so many changes. I hope this 30-minute webinar gives you some thoughts to contemplate. Again, I'm Mark Jarvis, and thank you for listening.